For decades, the world saw Ringo Starr as the smiling, easygoing Beatle who kept the rhythm steady and cracked jokes when the tension grew too heavy. To most fans, he was the comic relief, the least complicated of the Fab Four, the drummer who never seemed to take himself too seriously. But what if that image wasn't the full story? What if behind the grin and the one-liners, Ringo was hiding scars, betrayals, and secrets that almost tore him apart? Because the truth is, while Lennon and McCartney were hailed as geniuses and George was praised for his quiet brilliance, Ringo carried his own burden, one that nearly derailed his life more than once. His journey from sickly child in Liverpool to the stage of the Ed Sullivan Show wasn't just about luck or timing. It was about surviving illnesses that should have killed him, enduring betrayals from people he trusted most, and clawing his way back from the chaos of fame and addiction. And yet, somehow, through all of it, he kept reinventing himself, outlasting the odds, and proving he was far more than the punchline many tried to reduce him to. This isn't just the story of the Beatles' drummer. This is the untold journey of a man who lost nearly everything, found redemption when no one expected it, and left a legacy that even his critics can't deny. Richard Starkey, the boy who would one day become Ringo Starr, came into the world on July 7, 1940, in the gritty port city of Liverpool. From the start, life tested him in ways most children never have to endure. His father walked out when Ringo was just 4 years old, leaving his mother Elsie to raise him alone. She took jobs wherever she could, cleaning houses, bartending, working long hours, just to keep a roof over their heads. Despite her sacrifices, their life was far from easy, and Ringo's childhood became a battle of survival almost from the beginning. At 6 years old, he suffered a burst appendix that nearly ended his life. Complications led to a dangerous infection, and he was confined to a hospital bed for close to a year. For a boy who had already lost so much, the endless days of isolation could have crushed him, but instead, they sparked something unexpected. He learned to adapt, to find light even in the darkest places, and that resilience would become one of the defining traits of his life. Just when things began to settle, fate struck again. At 13, he was diagnosed with tuberculosis, a disease that still carried a heavy stigma and often proved fatal in the 1950s. He spent 2 years in a sanatorium, separated from friends, watching his teenage years slip by in a haze of treatments and routine. But it was here, surrounded by other sick children, that something remarkable happened. To keep spirits up, the hospital staff organized a makeshift band, handing out simple instruments for the kids to play. Ringo, too weak to move around much, was given a basic drum setup, a makeshift contraption with a mallet and a cabinet to bang on. The moment he struck his first beat, something clicked. He later said that from that moment on, he knew drumming was what he wanted to do with his life. Rhythm had found him in the middle of his sickness, and it gave him hope where there had been none. By the time he finally returned home, school was almost impossible to keep up with. He was too far behind, and his health had made him an outsider. Instead, he went straight into the workforce, taking odd jobs wherever he could. For a brief time, he worked at British Rail, then as an apprentice machinist. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept him moving forward. And then he discovered skiffle. Skiffle was raw, working-class music, born from scraps and cheap instruments, washboard percussion, tea-chest basses, beaten-up guitars. It was loud, chaotic, and alive, and Ringo connected to it immediately. He joined small local groups, playing whatever he could get his hands on, soaking in every rhythm. Music wasn't just a distraction anymore, it was becoming a way of life. In 1953, Ringo's mother remarried, bringing Harry Graves into his life. Unlike many stepfathers of the time, Harry was supportive, especially when it came to music. When Ringo showed interest in drumming, Harry encouraged it, and in 1957 he bought Ringo his first real drum kit. That Christmas gift would change everything. Suddenly, the boy who had spent half his childhood in hospitals had a purpose, and he chased it relentlessly. He practiced constantly, working on his timing, shaping a style that was more about feel than flash. While other drummers tried to show off, Ringo focused on serving the music, keeping it steady, keeping it alive. Soon, he joined Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, one of the biggest bands in Liverpool at the time. It was with Rory Storm that he first took on the name Ringo Starr, inspired by the rings he wore and the cowboy names he admired. The Hurricanes weren't world famous, but in Liverpool and Hamburg, they were stars, playing to wild crowds and sharpening their craft. Ringo stood out not because he was the loudest or the flashiest, but because he was dependable, stylish, and carried himself with a charisma that pulled people in. He even had his own drum solo, cheekily called Star Time, which audiences loved. It was in Hamburg, during those long nights of relentless playing in smoky clubs, that Ringo first crossed paths with another scrappy Liverpool group trying to make their mark, the Beatles. At the time, no one could have predicted how those chance encounters would alter music history. But for Ringo, it was the beginning of a path that would take him from hospital beds and factory floors to the biggest stages in the world. His childhood had been marked by sickness, abandonment, and struggle, but it also forged in him a resilience and humor that would carry him through the madness yet to come. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was starting to find his rhythm, and the world was about to hear it. When Ringo first crossed paths with the Beatles in Hamburg, it was far from the polished, world-dominating band people remember today. Back then, they were just another hungry group of young musicians grinding through endless sets in smoke-filled clubs, playing until their fingers bled for audiences that were often rowdy and unpredictable. The lineup wasn't even fixed. John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, Stuart Sutcliffe, and Pete Best were still trying to figure out who they were as a band. Ringo, meanwhile, was already making a name for himself with Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, one of Liverpool's most popular groups at the time. He was known for his steady, stylish drumming, his easy charm, and the way he could keep the chaos on stage anchored with a smile. During one of those Hamburg nights in 1960, he sat in on a session with John, Paul, and George, not realizing he was playing with the men who would eventually change music history. By 1962, the Beatles were climbing fast, but they faced a problem that could no longer be ignored. Producer George Martin had heard Pete Best play during an EMI test session, and he wasn't impressed. Martin suggested using a session drummer for recordings, a blow to the band's credibility. Lennon, McCartney, and Harrison knew they needed more than a drummer who looked cool on stage. They needed someone who could handle the pressure in the studio. They'd already played with Ringo a few times when Best couldn't make it, and they all agreed he was the better fit. Manager Brian Epstein was tasked with breaking the news, and though he agonized over it, he made the cut. Pete Best was out, and on August 18, 1962, Ringo Starr officially became a Beatle. The decision, however, sparked fury among fans. Best had built up his own following, especially among female supporters, and they weren't happy to see him replaced. At the Beatles' first show after the switch at Liverpool's Cavern Club, chaos erupted. George Harrison ended up with a black eye trying to defend Ringo from angry fans. It was a harsh welcome, but Ringo knew he had to push through if he wanted to prove himself. Even then, his position felt shaky. At his first recording session with George Martin, he was replaced by a session drummer and given only tambourine and maracas to play. For Ringo, it was a gut punch. He worried he'd be kicked out before he even had a chance to show what he could do. But instead of folding under the pressure, he stuck it out. Slowly, fans began to warm to him. His easygoing humor, self-deprecating style, and unique drumming approach made him impossible to ignore. Unlike many drummers who fought to show off, Ringo's style was simple, steady, and distinct. He played for the song, not his ego, and that made all the difference. By the time Beatlemania exploded, Ringo wasn't just accepted, he was loved. He was Lennon's sharp wit or McCartney's charm, but he was approachable, relatable, the one fans felt they could laugh with. His contributions went far beyond keeping time. He sang lead on tracks like Boys and later delivered some of the most beloved Beatles songs in the catalog. His first full writing credit came with Don't Pass Me By on the White Album, a quirky mix of humor and country influences that reflected his personality perfectly. Then came Octopus's Garden on Abbey Road, a song born from Ringo's fascination with the idea of an underwater escape. It was whimsical, lighthearted, and instantly memorable, a testament to his unique creative voice within a band of giants. And perhaps his most iconic vocal performance came with a little help from my friends on SGT, Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. It was everything a Ringo track was supposed to be: warm, sing-along friendly, and deeply human. Beyond the studio, Ringo's personality shone in the Beatles films. In A Hard Day's Night, his natural comedic timing and deadpan delivery made him a standout, with critics praising his screen presence. In Help, his knack for physical comedy cemented him as the band's comic relief, though his wit was far more than just an act. He had the rare ability to make people laugh without overshadowing the others, a quality that made him indispensable to the group's dynamic. By 1964, the Beatles had conquered Britain and were ready to take on America. Their arrival in New York was nothing short of historic. On February 9th, they appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show, performing before an audience of millions. It was a cultural earthquake, and Ringo was right in the middle of it. From that moment on, the Beatles weren't just a band, they were a global phenomenon. Through it all, Ringo remained the steady heartbeat, the glue that held the chaos together. He wasn't writing symphonies like Paul or pushing boundaries like John, but without his rhythm, humor, and grounding presence, the Beatles would have been a very different band. What began as a risky gamble in 1962 had paid off in ways no one could have imagined. Ringo Starr, the drummer who once feared he wouldn't last a single recording session, had become an irreplaceable part of the most famous band in history. And while the world saw the joy, the screaming fans, and the polished performances, cracks were already beginning to show behind the curtain, tensions that would one day threaten to tear everything apart. By the mid-1960s, the Beatles were on top of the world, but the cracks beneath the surface were beginning to show. For Ringo, life as a Beatle meant endless tour filled with deafening screams, so loud he often couldn't hear his own drumming. Concerts became a surreal blur, tens of thousands of fans shrieking nonstop, police barely containing the chaos, and the band forced to perform on tiny speakers that left them guessing if they were even in sync. Ringo later admitted he used to watch John's back and Paul's foot just to stay on beat because the roar of the crowd drowned out everything else. It was thrilling, but it was unsustainable. By 1966, after years of relentless touring, the band decided to stop performing live altogether, playing their final official concert at San Francisco's Candlestick Park. For Ringo, it was bittersweet. The tour were exhausting, but they had also been the heartbeat of Beatlemania. Now the group would retreat into the studio, and while this would give birth to some of their most groundbreaking music, it also exposed deeper tensions. The studio years transformed the Beatles into innovators, pushing boundaries with albums like SGT, Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, a record that redefined what rock music could be. But the freedom of studio experimentation came with a cost. Egos grew, creative clashes intensified, and each member began to drift into his own world. For Ringo, this shift was especially hard. He had always been the steady anchor, content to keep time and contribute when needed, but now he found himself sidelined more often, as Paul in particular pushed for perfection and sometimes recorded drum parts himself. The breaking point came during the recording of the White Album in 1968. Frustrated at being left out of sessions and feeling unappreciated, Ringo quietly packed up and left. For a few weeks, he was gone, the first Beatle to actually quit. He later admitted he felt like an outsider, convinced that John, Paul, and George were happier without him. But instead of moving on without him, the others quickly realized how vital he was to the band. They sent him telegrams begging him to return, telling him he was the best drummer in the world. When Ringo finally came back to the studio, he found his drum kit waiting for him, covered in flowers with a note that read, "Welcome back, Ringo." That gesture said it all. Even if he wasn't always the loudest voice in the room, he was the glue that kept them together. Still, the unity didn't last. The rooftop concert on January 30th, 1969 became both a triumphant moment and a symbol of the end. High above London on the roof of Apple Corps headquarters, the band played together one last time in public, delivering a raw, spontaneous performance that reminded everyone of their magic. Ringo sat behind the kit, steady as ever, keeping time as the city buzzed below. It was iconic, but it was also their swan song. Just over a year later, the Beatles were done. In April 1970, Paul McCartney announced he was leaving, and the dream was officially over. Fans and historians have debated the reasons ever since. Some blamed the death of Brian Epstein, the manager who had held everything together in the early days. Others pointed to John's relationship with Yoko Ono and her constant presence in the studio. Many believed it was simply creative differences, with each Beatle wanting to pursue his own vision. For Ringo, the breakup was devastating, but not entirely surprising. He had seen the fractures up close, the arguments, the silences, the tension in every recording session. Yet what made it especially painful was the public narrative that emerged. John and Paul were hailed as the geniuses, George was celebrated for stepping out of their shadow, and Ringo was often dismissed as the lucky one, the least talented member who just happened to be in the right place at the right time. But the truth was far different. Ringo's drumming style, steady, creative, and deceptively simple, was the foundation of the Beatles' sound. His humor and warmth had kept the band from imploding long before the official breakup. He may not have written dozens of hits, but he was essential, and the others knew it even if the world often forgot. As the 1970s began, Ringo faced an uncertain future. He was no longer the drummer of the most famous band in history, and he had to figure out who he was without the Beatles. The stage that had once made him a global icon was gone, and the friendships that had defined his life were fractured. For a man who had already overcome illness, abandonment, and near-death experiences as a child, this was just another test. But what lay ahead would prove that Ringo Starr's story didn't end with the Beatles. It was only entering a far more turbulent chapter. When the Beatles officially split in 1970, Ringo Starr faced a crossroads. He could have faded quietly into the background, remembered only as the drummer who kept time for the most famous band in history. But Ringo wasn't ready to disappear. Just months after the breakup, he launched his solo career, surprising fans with a very different direction. His debut album, Sentimental Journey, released in March 1970, wasn't rock and roll at all. It was a collection of Tin Pan Alley standards, old-fashioned songs arranged by top names like Quincy Jones and George Martin. Ringo dedicated the album to his mother, who loved those songs, and while critics were puzzled, it showed something important. He wasn't trying to compete with Lennon and McCartney's songwriting. He was carving out his own space. Later that year, he released Beaucoup of Blues, a country album recorded in Nashville with seasoned session players. Again, it wasn't what people expected, but it revealed his versatility and his willingness to follow his instincts rather than trends. The real breakthrough came in 1973 with the album Ringo. For the first time, all three of his former bandmates contributed in some way, even though they didn't appear together on a single track. The album produced massive hits like Photograph and You're 16, and suddenly Ringo had proven he could stand on his own. He wasn't just the Beatles' drummer anymore, he was a solo star with chart-topping songs of his own. The follow-up, Goodnight Vienna in 1974, kept the momentum going with more hits, and for a moment it looked like Ringo might sustain the kind of solo career few had expected. But fame has a way of turning, and by the mid-70s, things started to unravel. In 1975, he launched his own label, Ring-O Records, hoping to replicate the success of Apple Corps, but the venture quickly flopped. At the same time, his personal life was spiraling. Ringo dove headfirst into the rock and roll lifestyle, drinking heavily and surrounding himself with other hard-partying musicians like Keith Moon of The Who and Harry Nilsson. Together, they were part of a notorious drinking circle in Los Angeles nicknamed the Hollywood Vampires, and their wild antics often made more headlines than their music. Ringo admitted later that during this period, he was drunk most of the time, and his career began to suffer. Albums like Ringo's Rotogravure, 1976, and Stop and Smell the Roses, 1981, featured contributions from old friends like McCartney and Harrison, but the magic wasn't there, and sales were disappointing. He even abandoned songs John Lennon had written for him after Lennon's shocking death in 1980, saying it didn't feel right to record them without his friend alive. By the early 80s, Ringo's reputation was less about music and more about his excessive lifestyle. He struggled to find direction, drifting between projects and appearing in a handful of films that failed to make an impact. But just when it looked like his story might end as a sad footnote to the Beatles' legacy, Ringo did what he had always done. He found a way to adapt. In 1989, he launched the All-Star Band, a rotating supergroup made up of famous musicians who toured together, each taking turns in the spotlight. The concept was simple but brilliant. Fans weren't just coming to see Ringo, they were also coming to hear hits from the other stars on stage, whether it was Joe Walsh from the Eagles, Clarence Clemens from the E Street Band, or Dr. John. The All-Star Band became a phenomenon, and the tour continued to this day, showcasing Ringo's love for collaboration and his enduring appeal. Meanwhile, he found his footing in the studio again with albums like Time Takes Time in 1992, which critics hailed as his best work in years. Then came an emotional chapter in the mid-90s, when Ringo reunited with Paul McCartney and George Harrison to finish two unfinished John Lennon demos, Free as a Bird and Real Love. Released as part of the Beatles anthology, the songs marked the first new Beatles music in 25 years. For Ringo, it was more than just a project. It was a chance to reconnect with the band that had defined his life, to close the circle with Lennon's memory included. The singles became global hits, reminding everyone that the magic was still there, even decades later. Through the 2000s and beyond, Ringo kept releasing albums, never chasing trends but staying true to himself. Records like Liverpool 8 and Postcards from Paradise weren't chart toppers, but they proved he was still creating, still passionate about music. In 2018, he signed a publishing deal that secured the rights to his classics like Photograph and Octopus's Garden, ensuring his legacy would live on for generations. And even into his 80s, Ringo has never stopped touring with the all-star band, still flashing that same grin, still playing with the energy of a man half his age. His solo journey wasn't as smooth as McCartney's or as mythic as Lennon, but in its own way, it was just as remarkable. He stumbled, he spiraled, and he nearly lost himself, but he found redemption through music, friendship, and perseverance. Ringo's solo career proved what many had doubted, that he was more than just the other Beatle. He was a survivor, an artist in his own right, and a man who kept finding ways to turn chaos into rhythm. And yet, while his professional life was full of reinvention, his personal life was marked by turmoil that would test him even more deeply than fame ever did. Ringo Starr's professional journey after the Beatles had its ups and downs, but behind the scenes, his personal life was far more turbulent. His first great love was Maureen Cox, a Liverpool teenager who became a regular at the Cavern Club where the Beatles first cut their teeth. She was just 15 when she caught Ringo's eye, and despite the hysteria surrounding the band, their relationship grew quickly. By 1965, after discovering she was pregnant, they married in a rushed but private ceremony at Caxton Hall in London. Unlike the glamorous rock star weddings that would become common in later decades, theirs was small, almost secretive, with only a few family members and close friends in attendance. Yet even that modest day drew a frenzy of attention from reporters and fans desperate to get a glimpse of the new Beatle bride. Life with Ringo was never ordinary. At first, Maureen embraced her role, supporting him through tour, films, and recording sessions, often waiting at home with meals ready when he finally stumbled in from long nights at Abbey Road. But being married to a Beatle came with dangers. Fans who felt jealous of Maureen's position in Ringo's life didn't just throw insults. Some went further, threatening her or even attacking her physically. She had to give up her job as a hairdresser because of the constant harassment, and at times she was hounded just for stepping out in public. Yet she and Ringo built a family, raising 3 children, Zach, Jason, and Lee, in lavish homes filled with music, friends, and chaos. Their estates, with nicknames like Sunny Heights, became gathering places for celebrities and musicians, and for a while it seemed they had everything. But behind closed doors, cracks were forming. Ringo's drinking became heavier as the years went on, and with fame came temptations he didn't always resist. He admitted years later that he was unfaithful during their marriage, often absent and caught up in the whirlwind of being a rock star. The final blow came from a betrayal that shook the Beatles' inner circle to its core. George Harrison, Ringo's bandmate and close friend, confessed that he had fallen in love with Maureen. What began as secret glances turned into an affair, and when George's wife Pattie Boyd discovered them together, the truth came spilling out. John Lennon was reportedly furious, calling George's actions a form of virtual incest, given how close the Beatles considered themselves to be. For Maureen, the affair complicated an already strained marriage. She still wanted to hold things together for the children, but the trust was broken, and Ringo himself was far from blameless. His drinking, his violent outbursts, and his infidelity piled pressure on their relationship until there was nothing left to salvage. In 1975, the marriage officially ended in divorce. The settlement gave Maureen custody of the children along with financial support, but emotionally she was shattered. At one point, she attempted to take her own life, riding a motorbike into a wall in despair. Though she survived, the scars of the marriage and its collapse remained with her for years. Ringo, reflecting later, admitted openly, "I was a drunk, a wife-beater, and an absent father." A harsh but honest acknowledgement of the damage he had done. The fallout didn't end with the divorce. In the late 1980s, Maureen brought a lawsuit against the lawyers who had represented her in the settlement, claiming they had failed to properly assess Ringo's finances and cost her a fair deal. The case dragged on for weeks, with Maureen testifying about the chaos of their marriage and comparing Ringo to Andy Capp, a cartoon drunkard. Ultimately, she lost the case and was ordered to pay heavy legal fees, a cruel twist in a life that had already been filled with so much pain. After Maureen, Ringo moved on to a relationship with American model Nancy Lee Andrews, a fiery romance that lasted several years but ended in another bitter split. It seemed that Ringo was doomed to repeat the cycle of passion, excess, and heartbreak. But in 1980, while filming the comedy Caveman, he met Barbara Bach, a former Bond girl who would change his life. At first, it was just another on-set connection, but quickly it grew into something deeper. By 1981, they were married in a quiet civil ceremony, and while their early years together were rocky, both struggling with alcohol and drug use, they made a decision that would redefine their lives. In 1988, they entered rehab together, confronting their addictions head-on. From that point on, Ringo and Barbara committed to sobriety, and remarkably, they've kept that promise for decades. Their marriage, now lasting over 40 years, became the stability Ringo had never known before. Through her support and his newfound discipline, he rebuilt not only his personal life, but also his health and career. Looking back, Ringo's first marriage to Maureen was filled with youthful love, devastating betrayal, and heartbreak that shaped him in ways fame never could. It revealed his flaws, his destructive tendencies, but also his humanity. His second marriage to Barbara, in contrast, was a story of redemption, of learning from past mistakes, and finally finding a partner who could endure the storms with him. For a man who had spent so much of his early life in chaos, love had been both his downfall and his salvation. By the time Ringo Starr married Barbara Bach in 1981, he had lived through the kind of chaos most people wouldn't survive. He had endured a broken childhood, life-threatening illnesses, the whirlwind of Beatlemania, global fame, the collapse of the most famous band in history, a turbulent marriage, addiction, and the near destruction of his career. But with Barbara, something shifted. She wasn't just a partner, she was an anchor. Together, they faced down their demons, entering rehab in 1988 and committing to sobriety for good. For Ringo, it was a turning point. He once admitted that if he hadn't stopped drinking, he probably wouldn't have made it to the 1990s. Instead, he chose life, and that decision opened the door to a remarkable reinvention. In 1989, he launched the All-Star Band, a touring supergroup that became one of the most unique projects in rock history. The lineup changed constantly, but the idea remained the same: gather a collection of famous musicians, each with their own hits, and let them share the spotlight on stage. Ringo would play the Beatles' classics and his solo songs, then step aside while his bandmates performed their own. Fans loved it, and critics praised the concept. The All-Star Band wasn't about ego, it was about collaboration, something Ringo had always valued. More than 3 decades later, the project is still alive, with Ringo leading new versions of the band well into his 80s. The tour kept him in the public eye, but he wasn't done in the studio either. Albums like Time Takes Time, 1992, Vertical Man, 1998, and Liverpool 8, 2008, showed that he still had creative energy. He embraced modern production without abandoning the warmth and humor that defined his style. In 2010, he released Why Not, which included a collaboration with Paul McCartney, reminding fans that even though the Beatles were gone, their bond was still there. In later years, records like Postcards from Paradise, 2015, and What's My Name, 2019, continued his steady output, each one reflecting his playful spirit and his refusal to stop creating. In 2018, he signed a global publishing deal that secured the rights to songs like Octopus's Garden and Photograph, ensuring that future generations would hear them. Ringo also embraced new projects that surprised many. In 1994 and 1995, he reunited with Paul and George to finish John Lennon's Demos, resulting in Free as a Bird and Real Love, which became worldwide hits. For fans, hearing new Beatles songs in the 90s was nothing short of magical, and for Ringo, it was a chance to reconnect with his past on his own terms. Beyond music, Ringo also became a passionate advocate for peace and love, turning the phrase into his personal mantra. Each year on his birthday, he encourages fans around the world to say peace and love at noon, a simple act he believes can make a difference. His humor and charm never faded, and while many artists of his era grew bitter or withdrawn, Ringo seemed to grow lighter, more at peace with himself and his place in history. His legacy as a drummer also underwent a transformation. For decades, critics had dismissed his playing as simplistic, but over time, musicians began to recognize the brilliance in his style. Ringo wasn't flashy, but he was innovative. His left-handed approach on a right-handed kit created unique fills and rhythms that shaped the Beatles' sound. Songs like Come Together, Rain, and Ticket to Ride are now studied by drummers worldwide for their originality. Musicians from Phil Collins to Dave Grohl have praised him as one of the most influential drummers of all time. Personally, Ringo also became a symbol of endurance. He survived the dangers of fame that claimed so many of his peers, from Jimi Hendrix to Keith Moon. He survived the turmoil of his own mistakes, facing his darkest moments and choosing to rebuild. And he survived the constant shadow of the Beatles, managing to carve out a legacy that wasn't just tied to the past, but continued to evolve well into the 21st century. Today, Ringo Starr stands as more than just the funny Beatle or the lucky drummer. He is a survivor, a creator, and an artist who turned pain into rhythm, chaos into music, and loss into reinvention. His story is proof that even when the world underestimates you, resilience and humor can carry you through. From the hospital beds of his childhood to the stadiums of Beatlemania, from the ruins of addiction to the joy of sobriety, Ringo's life has been a constant reinvention. And while Lennon and McCartney may be remembered as the visionaries, and Harrison as the quiet mystic, Ringo Starr will always be remembered as the heartbeat, the man who kept time when everything around him was falling apart, and who, against all odds, is still keeping the beat to this day.